Ready for another deep dive? We're really getting into it this time with all these excerpts on multiculturalism, cultural diversity, ethnic groups, democracies. It's a lot.
It really is. It's like they all fit together, but the pieces are from different puzzles. We've got multi-nation states, polyethnic states, then there's national minorities versus immigrant groups.
Whoa, slow down. I'm seeing those terms too, but what do they even mean?
Oh, right, sorry. Imagine society is like a tapestry.
Okay.
Multi-nation state is like that tapestry, but woven from these totally different threads. Each thread is a whole national group with its own history.
So not just different cultures living together, but groups that feel like their own nations,
Hmm.
all within one larger state.
Exactly. Like think about indigenous populations in a place like Canada. Or the Quebecois. They were there before Canada was even Canada.
Yeah, so they want more than just like cultural rights.
Often, yeah. They often demand self-government rights.
Yeah.
Basically, they want real power over their own affairs, their own institutions, all while still being part of the larger nation, of course.
Makes sense. But how's it different from a polyethnic state? That's another term from these excerpts.
A polyethnic state is more like that tapestry, but it's always getting new threads woven in, formed by immigration. Think individuals, families, all coming from different places and choosing to make a new country their home.
The U.S. is like that, right?
The U.S. is the classic example, yeah. Waves of immigrants over centuries, tons of cultures.
And they probably need different things compared to those national groups we talked about. I mean, immigrants aren't trying to create their own separate government, right?
Usually not, no. They tend to focus more on what are called polyethnic rights. Things like making sure their languages and religions are respected, having access to services in their native language, protection from discrimination, obviously. Basically wanting to integrate, but without having to erase their identity in the process.
Sounds like a tough balance to strike. Respecting those identities, but also creating a unified nation.
It's a huge challenge. And it gets even more complex when you have groups that don't neatly fit either category.
Right.
Our sources brought up African Americans in the U.S., for example.
Yeah, that's a really good point. They're not immigrants in the usual sense, but they're not quite a national minority who, like, willingly joined the U.S. either.
Exactly. And their history with slavery and segregation makes their fight for equality and recognition so unique.
Mm.
And it shows how that old melting pot idea, it's kind of a myth.
Totally. Like the US and Canada are always seen as multicultural success stories, but these sources argue even they struggled with the rights of their national minorities, especially indigenous populations.
Absolutely. And especially in the Americas, those indigenous groups have claims that go way beyond anything we've mentioned so far. Their relationship with their ancestral lands, their own ways of governing themselves, spiritual practices. Colonization tried to wipe a lot of that out.
How do you even begin to fix that when you're trying to integrate groups whose histories are fundamentally different from the dominant culture?
That's where this idea of special representation rights often comes up. The argument is that simply having equal rights within the existing system, it's not enough. Not to make up for past injustices or to guarantee those voices are truly heard.
It's almost like those systems were designed to silence them in the first place, so equal access doesn't really level the playing field.
Right. Some countries are trying things like reserving seats in their parliaments specifically for indigenous representatives or giving those communities more autonomy over decisions about their land. But even those solutions come with their own baggage.
Seems like there's always this tension between group rights and individual rights. How do these sources say we should handle that? Where do you even draw the line?
Well, they talk about this concept called internal restrictions being super important. Basically, even if a state says, okay, this group has these collective rights, those rights shouldn't stomp all over the basic freedoms of the people within that group.
So protecting individuals even within their own cultures, if those cultures become oppressive.
Yeah, exactly. Like there are debates about certain traditional practices in some indigenous communities that might clash with broader human rights. Things like forcing girls into marriage or not letting women get an education or be leaders.
Man, that's a tough one. You're trying to respect cultural traditions, but also universal human rights are universal for a reason, you know?
It's a balancing act for sure. Some suggest that constitutional courts or human rights tribunals should step in when those collective rights clash with individual ones. It's messy, no doubt.
Makes you realize that multiculturalism isn't just festivals and food, huh? It gets into these really difficult questions of equality and justice.
Absolutely. And we have to understand the nuances of different cultures. We can't just assume we know what a whole community wants or needs based on stereotypes.
It's about constant dialogue, right? Being willing to actually have the tough conversations.
100%. And recognizing that even within one cultural group, there are going to be tons of different opinions. It's diversity within diversity. We can't treat groups as if everyone in them thinks the same way.
We've covered a lot, and all we've done is define what multiculturalism is.
And we haven't even gotten to how different societies have actually tried to put these ideas into practice.
Okay, well, now I'm even more curious. Let's talk about how this actually works in the real world. What are some ways governments are dealing with all of this? So we talked about what multiculturalism is, but how do you actually do it? Like, how do societies put this into practice? Seems kind of overwhelming.
Yeah, it's huge. And there's no one right answer, no magic formula. But the research does point to some common strategies, things that keep coming up. One big one is institutional design.
Like how a country actually structures itself.
Exactly. Its political systems, its social systems, how do those accommodate diversity? We touched on this with those special representation rights, but there's a lot more.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so one fascinating concept is legal pluralism. It's where you have different legal systems, like multiple systems, operating within the same country. We see this in some Latin American countries.
Seriously, how does that even work?
It's complex. But basically, they're recognizing that indigenous legal traditions are just as valid as the dominant system, so they're finding ways to incorporate them. Like, Bolivia has brought in these indigenous forms of community justice, conflict resolution. It's woven right into their national legal framework.
That's wild. It totally challenges this idea we have in the West that there's only one right way to do law. Are there other, I don't know, less radical examples?
Tons. Language policy is a big one. A lot of countries are moving away from having just one official language. Canada is the obvious example with English and French. But did you know South Africa recognizes 11 official languages?
11? Seriously?
Seriously. And it's not just symbolic. It means they have to provide services, education, even court proceedings in multiple languages. It's a logistical nightmare, probably, but it makes a powerful statement.
It says you belong here no matter what language you speak.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper. Some places are doing something called intercultural bilingual education, where indigenous languages and cultures are actually part of the school curriculum alongside the dominant language.
So it's about making sure those languages and cultures don't disappear.
Exactly. It's a totally different way of thinking about assimilation. But as with everything, it's not that simple. Even within indigenous communities, there are disagreements. Some groups might say, actually, preserving our language perfectly is more important than having tons of people speak it, even if it's not always correct.
So you can't just come in with these blanket solutions, even if they sound good on paper.
Exactly. Governments have to actually talk to the people, the communities they're trying to help. Really listen and understand what they want, what they need. Because the top-down approach, it almost never works.
Makes sense. So we've talked about concrete policies, but do these sources say anything about the bigger picture? Like, does having a more diverse population actually affect how well a democracy functions?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And of course, the answer is, it depends.
Figured. Two sides to every coin.
For sure. Some argue that diversity is essential for a healthy democracy. More viewpoints, more ideas competing. It makes the public debate more vibrant. Like that saying, two heads are better than one.
The marketplace of ideas. You need different products to make a market work.
Right. And then there's the argument that diverse populations are just better at adapting, at dealing with change. Different skills, different life experiences, different ways of seeing the world. It all becomes a strength.
Diversity equals resilience. Okay, but I know it can't all be sunshine and roses. What about the downsides? Are there worries about diversity being bad for democracy?
Definitely. One of the big ones is that it could lead to more friction, more instability. If different cultural or ethnic groups have totally opposite goals, or if they feel like their identities are under attack, well, that's how conflict starts, and it makes governing a lot harder.
Yeah, we've seen that happen. When people exploit those differences, those tensions, it can get dangerous really fast.
Exactly. And that's why fostering this sense of shared national identity is so important, even while you're celebrating all those different identities.
How do you even do that? Find that balance between unity and difference.
Well, that's where things like intercultural dialogue come in, creating chances for people from different backgrounds to actually get to know each other, break down those stereotypes, build some trust, and education, obviously.
It's got to be proactive, right?
Right.
It's not enough to just say, hey, everyone's welcome here. You have to make people feel like they actually belong.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
And that means tackling things like systemic inequalities, discrimination, Those things make people feel excluded, no matter how much diversity you have on the surface.
So it's about more than just tolerance. It's about making sure everyone has the same opportunities, regardless of their background.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process, not a finish line you cross. It requires always questioning, always adapting, always being willing to listen and learn from each other.
Multiculturalism isn't just some box you check off, huh? It's about making diversity a strength, not a problem to be solved.
Exactly. And that diversity should be everywhere in government, in how we express ourselves culturally in our everyday lives.
It's about changing how we think, moving away from us versus them to a place where we recognize we're all in this together.
And each thread, each unique story, each different perspective makes the whole tapestry richer and stronger. But speaking of tapestries, Latin America is really interesting when we're talking about all this.
Oh, yeah. The sources focused a lot on that region and their different approaches to multiculturalism.
For good reason. It's like all the layers of history and culture there.
Yeah.
It's incredibly complex. You have those deep indigenous roots, then colonialism, waves of immigration from all over.
And each group with its own needs, its own demands. Were there any examples that stood out to you, successes or failures? It's like everything's more intense in Latin America, more history, more cultures.
And that's forced those countries to really think about this stuff. They can't just ignore it. They have to actually build societies that work for everyone.
So are they? I mean, are there any success stories? Are there approaches that actually seem to work?
Yeah, definitely. One thing a lot of countries have done is put multiculturalism right into their constitutions, officially recognize it. It's like saying, this is who we are, all these different groups, and we're owning it.
Not even trying to pretend everyone's the same.
Exactly. And that's led to some cool stuff. Colombia, for example, they reserve seats in their Congress for representatives of Black, Indigenous, and Roma communities. So they have a guaranteed voice at the highest levels of government.
Wow, that's huge. I bet that's been a game changer for those communities.
Definitely. And it's not just about who's in charge. Land rights are another biggie, especially for indigenous groups. So many of them were kicked off their land or had it straight up stolen.
Yeah, that's a tragically familiar story, and not just in Latin America.
Nope. But now, more and more countries are starting to recognize those collective land rights. Like, Brazil's created these massive indigenous territories where those communities have genuine autonomy, real control over the land. It's about time. Recognizing that connection to the land, the right to self-determination.
Totally. And it recognizes that these communities often know best how to care for the land. They've been living there sustainably for centuries. They have so much knowledge.
It's not just about fixing past mistakes. It's about what we can learn from those different ways of being.
Absolutely. Which brings up something we haven't really touched on yet, the economics of all this. We talk about diversity in social and political terms, but what about economics? How do you create systems that are fair and inclusive for everyone?
Right, because if some groups are always stuck at the bottom economically, then real equality is impossible. What's happened to Latin America on that front?
So there's this interesting thing called ethno-development, where the goal is to empower marginalized groups to develop their own economic activities based on their cultures and traditions. So not just trying to fit into a system that wasn't built for them, but creating something new.
Exactly. Like in a lot of indigenous communities, there's a renewed focus on traditional crafts, textiles, agriculture, and we're seeing governments and NGOs supporting that. Because it's sustainable, it helps preserve culture.
It shows that cultural diversity and economic progress don't have to be enemies. They can work together.
For sure. But, and I know you can see this coming, it's not always easy. The research really stresses that even with good intentions, a law or a policy doesn't magically make everything perfect.
Right. Just because it's written down doesn't mean it's actually happening in the real world.
100%. There's always bureaucracy, people resisting change. Sometimes even corruption gets in the way.
And on top of all that, you have to make sure that the people actually benefiting from these changes are the ones who get to decide what those changes should be.
Right. The last thing you want is some outsider coming in with all the answers, telling people what they need. True multiculturalism means listening, especially to the people you're trying to help.
It's about giving them the power to shape their own future, decide what success looks like for them.
Exactly. Shifting power, challenging the way things have always been done. That's how we create a world that's more just for everyone.
This deep dive has really made me think. We've gone from these big abstract ideas about multiculturalism all the way to what it looks like on the ground, the successes, the challenges.
It's been great exploring all this with you, and I think the big takeaway is that multiculturalism isn't some finish line you cross. It's a journey. It's about constant dialogue, figuring things out as you go, and being open to learning from each other.
Couldn't have put it better myself. So as we wrap up today, I want to ask our listeners, what really stuck with you? What insights are you taking away from this conversation? Because building a better, more inclusive world, that's on all of us. It starts with these conversations, these difficult questions, and it doesn't end here. So until next time, keep asking those questions, keep challenging those assumptions, and keep talking to each other.
To a more multicultural future.
Cheers to that.